And I think we can begin. So it's great to see all of you. Shabbat Shalom. We are trying to return to the model that we had done in our building, which was Shabbos services at 6, dinner at 7, and a little learning at 8 o'clock. The only difference is dinner is either on your couch like the Youngmans or quickly at the table separately, but then we can all convene once again for our learning. And when I deliver sermons, I usually don't write them out word for word. I like to speak more freely. But what someone commented after my sermon was, Rabbi, in Yom Kippur, you spoke about this scroll, but how did it happen that it arrived in Newton? And I said, oops, I left out an important detail. We're going to have to gather once again. And so Rebecca Cohan, who's a member of our synagogue, is here, and she's going to share a little bit soon. But before she does, I want to say a few words. One is Mazel Tov to Rebecca, because just yesterday, she was blessed with another grandson. And so we welcome Gabriel Thomas LaRochelle Cohen.
Yes.
So Mazel Tov, Rebecca, at 5:30 p.m. So Rebecca and I were on a trip to Israel with 33 other members of our temple community last November, so about 11 months ago. And we were in the old city. And if anyone's, raise your hand if you've been to Israel. Many people here have. You might be walking along the old city towards the Kotel. It's a great place. There's a huge courtyard. And it becomes a very familiar meeting spot. It's been a large courtyard, and years ago, there was a large kind of rainbow, stones that made a rainbow. It's kind of a marker from 1977. Let's remember, Israel only conquered the old city and had it returned in 1967. So in 1977, they built this ark after this ruined synagogue. And I'll share more about the details later. But it became a real centerpiece. It was at one point the largest synagogue in Jerusalem, and a really beautiful one known as the Hurva, known as the ruin. And Rebecca said to me, as I mentioned during the sermon, I think I have something from the Hurva. So Rebecca, will you share a little bit about how you acquired this scroll?
I will. I'd be glad to. I'm not muted, right?
You're not muted.
Okay. So let me share just a little bit about my family. My grandparents, my great-grandparents, Benjamin Cushing and Rebecca from Ukraine and Russia, came to the US in 1893, pregnant with my grandmother, Bessie. So this is my mother's mother, Bessie. And in 1899, the family settled in Norwood. They were the first Jews in Norwood. And a few years later, they founded the Norwood Synagogue. So now let me switch to my other great-grandparents by the name of Sachs. My great-grandfather, Baruch Jacob, married Rachel. This was in Israel, and before it was Israel. And they had 5 sons and 2 daughters. So their names are Leah, Bashka, Wolf, Chaim, Albert, Elimelech, and Benjamin. The youngest was Benjamin. That's my grandfather, my mother's father. So how did these 2 people come together? My great-grandfather, Benjamin Cushing, was looking for a tutor for his children in Hebrew. Benjamin Sachs had left Israel to come to Boston to go to medical school. He was looking for a job to help support himself. So my great-grandfather hired him to tutor his 3 children, one of whom was my grandmother, Bessie. That's how Benjamin and Bessie met. Benjamin, as I just read off the number of siblings, comes from a very large family. And my grandmother, Bessie, was a real connector, organizer, manager type person. And she made sure to maintain relationships with this whole huge family in Israel, even those who had dispersed all over the world, Brazil, New Zealand, South Africa, London, and many in the United States. So this was very important to my grandmother, Bessie, and therefore to my mother, Tikva. When my grandmother passed away in 1974, my mother took possession of this thing. I didn't know about it yet, but when my mother then moved from her house to North Hill, she was cleaning out and presented to me this box with a glass top that contained in it a piece of burnt Torah scroll. And I don't know whether we can get a photograph of this box, but the box is about 12 inches wide by 10 inches deep, has a glass top, and inside is the piece of Torah, a dish of what I assume was baking soda, and a note, a handwritten note from my grandmother. Oh, good. There it is. Okay. I hope everybody can see it on their screen. That's what the box looks like. In the top right corner is this little dish of baking soda. And that note, I know you can't read it. So the note says, this piece of Torah salvaged by Mordechai Caspi when Arabs burned the Hurva synagogue in the old city of Jerusalem during the pogrom upon Jews by the Arabs in 1926. Rivka Caspi, widow of Mordechai, gave this to me in 1952. And my mother said to me, so do you want this? And I said, of course I want this. And it sat actually not in my basement. It sat on the coffee table in my living room for years. And then I moved it to a shelf in the living room for a whole lot more years. I made a couple of attempts to find somebody who would be interested in it. Brandeis, Harvard Museum, not very successful. Fast forward to the trip to Israel, and I had this photograph of it that I shared with our guide, Uri, who said, oh my goodness, this is important. You need to talk to your rabbi, talk to Rabbi Joel about it, which I did. And he said, oh, this is the Hurva synagogue. And I said, oh, okay. And when we got back to Boston, came back home, I looked up in the genealogy that my mother had written of the Sachs family to find who is Rivka and Mordechai. And I found that one of my grandfather's siblings, the oldest one, Leah, she married Israel Cohan and had a whole lot of children, among whom was Rivka. Rivka married Mordechai Caspi. So they were first, so Rivka was a first cousin to my mother. And then suddenly it started to become important. And I contacted Joel and I said, can I bring this to you? Which I did. And Joel looked at it and you can take the story from there, Joel. But that's how it came into my possession.
So Rebecca brought it to me, and I have a number of connections in Jerusalem. And ultimately, I was passed to a small organization that's in the old city that really oversees all of the construction in the old city. And the Hurva synagogue has a really interesting history, which I'm going to jump into soon. But I'll go a little backwards in that we know it was destroyed by the Jordanians in 1948. The Jordanians, when they conquered Jerusalem in 1948, destroyed many, many synagogues, 57 in the old city. And the Hurva was obviously the most prominent. So it was destroyed, and the rubble sat there until 1967. So in 1967, the Israelis debate what to do with it. And they hire a very famous architect named Louis Kahn, who had done Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia and a number of prominent synagogues. And Kahn developed a very elaborate plan for construction. It was too elaborate. In fact, it was rejected because they thought it would overpower the Dome of the Rock and overpower the Kotel, the wall. And it was rejected. And it just, they left the plan. And in 1977, instead, they built this rainbow over it. And it really sat there until Teddy Kollek, who is the longtime mayor of Jerusalem, said enough already. And this little organization was given the rights to oversee the reconstruction. And they finally agreed to reconstruct it the way it had existed, as this most beautiful, largest synagogue in all of Israel, many claims. And so it was built in 2010. And I told the story. It's pretty amazing that there were only 2 synagogues at the quarry that day. So the stone of our building, it's known as Jerusalem stone. But Jerusalem stone is really from the Negev. Can you hear me? Some people just chatted. Okay, good. So it's from the Negev desert, where stone is, there's a lot of stone to extract from the ground. So our architect traveled to the Negev and met another architect. Only 2 synagogues were there that day, Temple Beth Elohim and the Hurva. So it's really quite fascinating. By the way, there is one quarry I learned from our architect in Jerusalem itself, but Jerusalem's a city. It's rare to have a quarry in the middle of a city, but there is one quarry in Jerusalem. Our architect went there as well, because the stone that's not outside, but the stone that's underneath the ark, there's one piece of Jerusalem stone on our ark. It's huge. It's so heavy that we had to, once it arrived, change the whole floor because of the weight. And originally, the ark was supposed to move for the High Holy Days. Once he decided on that piece of Jerusalem stone from Jerusalem, it was no longer going to move. What interested me was when the stone came into our building, I thought it was defective because it's got a pinkish hue if you look at it closely. And what I learned is that while Jerusalem of gold, I thought the gold stone, the only quarry in Jerusalem, actually the stone was quite pink. The gold stone on our building is actually from the Negev, and it's the exact same as the Hurva. So Susan, if you can just show a picture that I sent, if possible, of the modern Hurva synagogue. And I'm going to give a brief history, and then I'm going to lead to Gideon, which is our second amazing connection at TBE. That's me actually in the office of the redevelopment committee. There's a picture of a Jordanian soldier on the rubble, and there's the new Hurva synagogue. And you can see obviously the stone. Great, let's take that down. So now a quick history of the Hurva synagogue. By the way, Hurva means ruin in Hebrew. What's interesting is it's not from the ruin of the Jordanians. So we know that the Jewish presence in Jerusalem goes back thousands and thousands of years. But it was in the 13th century that an Ashkenazic community comes to Jerusalem and builds a number of buildings on the site where the Hurva is, synagogues, apartments, and that's what stood there until the 1700s, when a man named Judah HaChassid, a mystic from Eastern Europe, and his followers traveled to Jerusalem. So it's common for a rabbi to bring his community to settle in Jerusalem or settle in the land of Israel. The problem was, in this case, a few weeks after the group arrived, Judah HaChassid died. And so many of his followers said, oh my gosh, our leader's not here. We just came to Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't the high-tech country it is today. And they went back home. And a small community stayed there. The problem was, after they started building the building, they quickly ran out of money. And so what do you do when you run out of money and you're amidst a building project? You borrow it. So in this case, they tried to borrow it. They borrowed it from local Arab lenders. And then they borrowed a little more, and they borrowed a little more, and they borrowed a little more to different lenders. And soon they realized they were really deep in the hole and they owed a lot of money. And eventually they were imprisoned. And instead of a large synagogue in the old city, there was actually a pile of rubble. And so it became known as the ruin, literally the Hurva. It was really the ruin of Judah HaChassid. Until 1812, when a new group comes, followers of the Vilna Gaon, and they wanted to build a synagogue on the same spot. It was this amazing spot in the old city of Jerusalem. There's a bunch of pile of rocks there. The problem was there are different communities. The question is, do they need to pay the debt of the prior community? So according to the Arabs, they're thinking, oh, you're building the same synagogue. You owe us the money. And from their mind, they have no connection to the other community. They want to come debt-free. Now we bring in a man named Shlomo Zalman Soref, who helped save the day, a Lithuanian-born silversmith who actually travels. And I didn't know when I delivered the sermon that it turns out that he is closely related to a TBE member, of course, Gideon Argov, who emails me from Yom Kippur and explains the connection. I said, oh my gosh, Gideon, you've got to share. So Gideon, Shlomo Zalman Soref. Can we unmute you? Let's see. How about now? There we go.
So thank you for that. And let me say a couple of words first about, just to add to what Joel just, can you hear me? Is that okay? To what Joel just said about the history. You know, the context of why the Jews come, you know, in 1700, you know, to Jerusalem. And when we think about Jews going to Jerusalem, we think about Jerusalem today, which is a city of about 1 million people. So there were about 1,200 Jews in Jerusalem in the year 1700. And there were about 5,000 to 8,000 people in the entire city at the time. That is context. It's a very small place. And this fellow, Judah Chassid, was a mystic, exactly as the rabbi said. About 50 years before then, in the mid 1600s, there was a movement. First of all, there was a series of horrific pogroms in Lithuania, in which the Cossacks, who were basically used as essentially agents of terror by the Lithuanians and whoever was in control, and that territory shifted from one empire to the other to hound the Jews, and thousands of Jews were killed. And the Jews of the area of all of Europe were horrified by this, because it was about 20 to 50,000 Jews, depending on where you read it, who were killed in these pogroms. And there was a mystical movement led by a guy called Shabtai Tzvi, who thought he was the Messiah and actually proclaimed himself the Messiah. And there were followers of this guy, and all kinds of groups that really were looking for, I guess, redemption in any way, shape, or form, including a Messiah in the flesh and blood, which is a bizarre episode. He actually ended up, that guy, going to Palestine and marrying a mentally unstable woman in Jerusalem. He was from Izmir, not Ashkenazi, and he ended up actually converting to Islam when he was actually given the choice of either converting to Islam or being put to death. So he was not a good story, Shabtai Tzvi, but he had people who were quasi-followers, and this is what prompted some of these folks, including Yehuda Hasid, to go to Jerusalem at this time. And by the time he got there, he had about 1,000 followers with him. So it doubled the size of the Jewish population in Jerusalem from about 1,200 to just over 2,000, which is a crazy thought. And then he died, just as Rabbi Joel just said, literally 4 months after he got there. So so now we go to exactly, again, as Joel said, 1811, a guy by the name of Zalman Shlomo. He was not a tzoref at the time yet. He was not a silversmith. He was an immigrant. He was from the town of Kedan in Lithuania, and he was inspired to go to Jerusalem to actually build a life and actually redeem the land of Israel. And with him, there were about 30 families on that boat. This is significant in some ways because this was the beginning of real organized aliyah of groups of Jews, not just to pray, but also to actually settle a land. You know, in the year 134, Jerusalem was destroyed and razed to the ground by the Romans after the Second Revolt. And Jews could not live in Jerusalem for centuries. And so this was really, after over 1,000 years, this was really the first time that groups of Jews began to go there. So these guys arrived. He couldn't go to Jerusalem, exactly like Joel said, because Jews were barred actually from living in Jerusalem when he got there. Ashkenazi Jews, not Sephardic Jews, but Ashkenazi Jews were barred. And they were barred because of the borrowings that Yehuda Hasid left behind, because these debts were never paid. And so Ashkenazi Jews could not live in Jerusalem. So they went to Tzfat, which was another Jewish community in the north, obviously. They lived there for about a year. And then what they did was actually, this is related to, unfortunately, what we're going through today. In 1813, there was an epidemic that spread in the north of Palestine. And many residents fled the region for obvious reasons. No vaccines. Zalman apparently saw this as a way to make himself, make his way to Jerusalem. And he took about 10 families from Tzfat to join him in Jerusalem. He actually went in dressed as a Sephardic, all the people with him dressed as Sephardic Jews, so that the guards at the gates of the city, remember, this is all inside the walls of the city, would not stop them because they were Ashkenazi Jews. And he made it in to Jerusalem. And when he was in Tzfat, those 2 years, he had studied silversmithing. He learned the craft of basically working with silver. And that's why he was known as tzoref. Tzoref in Hebrew, silversmith or goldsmith, in this case, silver. And he was apparently quite talented, which it's hard to think that I might be related to him since he was talented with his hands, and I am not, but he was. And many of his clients, both Jewish and Arab, liked him. He built a business, and he became known as sort of somebody who bridged between different communities. He apparently had a gift for communicating and bringing people together. The Ashkenazi community grew, and he began to be a person who was sent and asked to raise money by the community in order to do various public projects. For example, a hospital, one of the first hospitals in Jerusalem, he raised the money for. He actually traveled to Europe. He was sent by the community several times to Europe in order to raise funds, including getting permits from the rulers of the region in order to do these things. He went to Egypt and he met with the ruler, Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, the ruler of Egypt. This is a long time ago, and received from him something called a firman. A firman is a royal Turkish mandate. Doesn't exist anymore, but these are royal mandates given by the Ottoman Empire, which allowed him to formally lead a project to renovate the Hurva complex and build synagogues there. And he also got a document which annulled the debts of the Ashkenazi community from previous generations after 100 years. And so in 1836, Zalman Tzoref, he's now known as Tzoref because he's a silversmith, is devoting himself more or less full-time to building the first synagogue to be rebuilt in the Hurva lot, which was known as the Menachem Tzion synagogue, which was a small synagogue built on the same lot. And he began blueprints for a larger synagogue nearby, despite the hostility of the Arab, the Muslim creditors who were hostile to him. There are many other aspects of his life that I won't go through. He still found time to work as a goldsmith. Unfortunately, his determination to renovate the Hurva kindled the hatred of the local Arab community, and it actually cost him his life. There were two attempts to kill him. The first, somebody tried to shoot him in 1851. He missed. And actually, the guy who tried to shoot him was found dead the next day at the bottom of a well. I'm not sure how that happened. But then, unfortunately, a few weeks later, he was murdered, or he was attacked with a saber and hit on the head, and his brain was injured. And he lived for about 4 months, I believe, after that, before he expired. But he lived, and he was able to communicate with his family, but he was never able to come back to be active. And then he died, and was buried near the tomb of Zechariah on the Mount of Olives, which is where his wife was also buried. That was Shlomo Zalman Tzoref. His grandson, so first of all, the Hurva was completed by his son, whose name was Mordechai, and he actually finished the project. And he was a very prominent leader of the Ashkenazi community in Jerusalem. His grandson, who was Mordechai's son, was a man called Yoel Moshe Solomon. And Yoel Moshe Solomon was a phenomenally active and creative leader in the Ashkenazi community. And among other things, he built and opened a printing house. He actually published the first Hebrew monthly, which was called Halevanon, the Lebanon. It has nothing to do with Lebanon, but it was called Halevanon. He actually was also sent to other countries to raise funds for hospitals. He started he was the person who raised funds for what became Jerusalem's second largest hospital, Shaarei Tzedek. He was the person who started that. And he also, even more importantly, the old city was getting very crowded. This is the 1850s, and the old city is getting quite crowded. And he had the foresight to build the first private neighborhood outside of the old city walls. Now that's not the first housing. The first housing was built by Moses Montefiore, Sir Moses Montefiore, the British lord. But that was built, and it's called Mishkenot Sha'ananim, and many of you perhaps have been there or know it. But that was built for Jewish workers. It was not for families. Nachalat Shiv'ah, which technically in Hebrew means the settlement of the seven being seven families, was conceived as a private neighborhood in which seven families, who basically bound themselves together, decided we're going to live outside of the city walls. They pooled their funds, and they started buying buildings property rather, and ultimately created what became this first community outside of the wall. So, and finally, this gentleman, Yoel Moshe, in addition to that, raised money for the first houses in what became Petach Tikva, which is actually, of course, near Tel Aviv today, and was one of the first settlements in this area, which really was mostly swamp that was near the Mediterranean. So he was an incredibly energetic and capable, interesting guy. His great-grandson was my great-grandfather, and his name was Sinai Solomon. Sinai Solomon, I should show you some things here. If you let me share content here for a moment, I'll do that. If you can, only the host can share in the meeting. Okay.
Make you a host.
The host is omnipotent, so the host will let me share.
You will now be able to.
Now, Gideon.
All right. You're amazing. Here we go. Photos. So I'm going to share.
I gather right behind you is Ben Gurion and your father.
On the right behind me, I'll get to that. Yes, exactly. So this is the This is the memorial that is today in the Mount of. This was done after the fact because their graves were desecrated by the Jordanians, and so this was put there many years later. And it says Shlomo Zalman, who helped to save the Ashkenazi community in Jerusalem, the builder of the new Hurva synagogue, and murdered by Bnei Evla, which means sons of evil, essentially in Hebrew, because of his activities in building the Hurva synagogue. It says after the War of Independence, their graves were desecrated by the Jordanians, and they were rebuilt by his descendants, and that's him. And then stop share. Here's another one, and then this is Yoel Moshe Solomon. This is his grandson, who built the first Jewish community outside the city walls, and he is my great-grandfather's great-grandfather. Okay, and we'll get to a bit more in a second, and then we get to my great-grand. Yep.
The street that has his name, many people have shopped on in this group.
Yes, it's called Yoel Moshe Solomon Street. There's also a very famous song sung by Arik Einstein, which is called Yoel Moshe Solomon, which is just everybody knows it in Israel, and tells sort of the story of his life, including the legend that when he died, he turned into a bird, and there's a whole story about that. This is his great grandson, and that is Sinai Solomon, as well as my great grandmother Safta Nechama, and he was a apothecary. He had what basically amounted would be a drugstore, I guess today, in the old city of Jerusalem. He was quite an interesting guy. He went into the Kaiser's army in World War I, and served in the Kaiser's army because this was part of the Ottoman Empire. I have his German Iron Cross in somewhere in a box somewhere. But he also, strangely enough, when Herzl visited Jerusalem in, I think it was 1912, and he met with the Kaiser in Jerusalem. The Kaiser was visiting the city, and Palestine. It was his only visit to the Middle East. You can imagine that was a very big kind of trip to take. He was chosen to basically admit Herzl into the tent outside the Jaffa Gate where Herzl had his meeting with the Kaiser of Germany. So he actually was in the meeting. Extraordinary stuff. And yes, then you get to the last photo I'll show is his his grandson, and which is my late father. So my father, whose name was Shlomo Zalman Margovsky, and he was named directly after Shlomo Zalman Soref. And it is true that if you look at the picture here, exactly as Rabbi Joel was saying, this is a picture of him with David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the modern state of Israel. This is in the Ben-Gurion was short, my father was tall, you can see that. And it's kind of, you can't make it up, is how I would describe this story, right? And the sad part is, of course, that my father, who was an Israeli diplomat, was also assassinated, and he was. It also took him a while to actually die. He took him not months, but years. But he was attacked, also, injured in a head injury in London when he was the ambassador of Israel to the court of St. James, and he was shot through the head, which unfortunately started a war in 1982, and he ended up dying years later. And so what's fascinating is the Rashas, which are basically the first letters of Shlomo Zalman Tzorf's name, are Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, and that's Reish. Basically, he's known as the Rashaz, which is the first initials of his name. He was actually the first recognized victim of terror in sort of in Israel's modern history. And on Mount Herzl, which is where all of Israel's presidents and are buried, there's actually a commemorative plaque to him as being the first victim of terrorism in the modern state of Israel. And, 5 generations later, his direct descendant, my father, also a victim of terror in an unprovoked attack on an unarmed diplomat. So it's a very, everybody in Israel has a story. And so this is not, this happens to be my story. But I find it to be quite amazing to be connected in yet another way to this temple, which is really a second home and a place where I always feel like, I can breathe so differently when I'm in that sanctuary, and it makes me feel very much at home. And it's very emotional, actually, to be telling this story, and I was very happy to share it.
Thank you so much, Gideon, and just to think of you now sitting in the walls of Beth Elohim, surrounded by this stone, with the history of your family and these deep connections is really, really quite extraordinary. As Gideon shared, his family played a very deep and extraordinary role in the development of the state of Israel. So can you show the book that you just showed me that I hope you'll loan to me? Because I really want to read it. So it's called 10 Generations.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not much to read because it's actually a list of names, and there are close to 20,000 people who are descendants of Shlomo Zalman Tzorf, and they are assiduously documented in this book. It's 209 years this year since that trip that he took to Palestine. 95% of those people apparently live in Israel today. And so it's a big clan, and it's basically like a phone book. So I'm not sure it's worth reading, but I'm going to come show it to you. Anyway.
Thank you again. So the Hurva is rebuilt. We're walking along. Rebecca tells me about the scroll. I bring the scroll to Jerusalem in my carry-on. I am warned by friends that the only place that gives you a hard time bringing a Torah scroll into the country is Israel, for tax purposes, etc. So I quickly put it in my carry-on and didn't know the value of it at all. I actually thought they might say, we have plenty of these. The first morning, as I shared with you, I brought it to the small office and they started to cry. that this was the only remnant, and that they're bringing it to the Israel Museum to have people work on it, the people who did the Dead Sea Scrolls. I didn't realize, just based on the picture, they didn't tip or give me any hint that it was going to be significant, but they had already prepared a place for it in the synagogue to be displayed that would preserve the parchment. And so my prayer is that when we travel to Israel together, we walk into the Hurva and see the scroll and are reminded of Rebecca's family, of Gideon's family, of our extraordinary community, and our connection to the Hurva synagogue. You'll look at that scroll with the burn marks around it, and as I mentioned, you can make out the story, and it's the story of Noah. Our Torah portion this week, we read the story of Noah, just as they will at the Hurva synagogue, just as they did from that scroll centuries ago. The story of the world nearly destroyed and born again and rebuilt. And that's what we are doing. That's what they are doing in the land of Israel. And my prayer is that we join together and go from strength to strength. I'll just close with the World Zionist Congress was this week. And some people have asked me what happened. There was a compromise. I don't know if you know this, Gideon, if you followed the politics of the World Zionist Congress. It's like the Knesset, the World Zionist Congress. It started with Herzl, and Herzl knew he had a lot of different parties that he had to manage. Fortunately, he was a very good politician, Herzl. It requires a good politician because we're a diverse people. In the case of the World Zionist Congress, there's a deep divide between the ultra-Orthodox right now and liberal Jews in the diaspora. And there was going to be a big divide in the World Zionist Congress because while we got more votes, liberal Jews in the diaspora this year, thanks to our synagogue and many others, the ultra-Orthodox got more votes. They turned out in huge numbers. It is true in world Jewry today that the ultra-Orthodox Jews are more present in the political process in many ways. And so they were able to wield a great deal of power along with the Likud party. And the Likud party and the ultra-Orthodox parties, just like in the Knesset, tried to create a coalition that would not include the liberal Jews of the diaspora. And so what happened in the last 3 days is some heavy politicking in the World Zionist Congress that the left of center parties were able to woo the center, Hadassah and B'nai B'rith and a few other organizations to create a coalition between the right and the left. The left is largely represented by the Blue and White Party and Gantz, and the right, the Likud Party in the World Zionist Congress and the ultra-Orthodox parties. And this coalition agreed to place some liberal members in important cabinet positions. So for now, we have a coalition government in the World Zionist Congress, which I guess shouldn't come to the surprise of anyone. And the good news is that everyone has a seat at the table. But I think the important thing is that we continue to demonstrate our deep commitment to Israel and to the Jewish people. Our history is really quite extraordinary, and the smallness of the Jewish people is highlighted this evening. These unbelievable connections. I've always been told that everyone in the world is connected by 6 degrees of separation, but Jews are 4 degrees of separation. I'm beginning to think it might be 3. So with that, Gideon, Rebecca, thank you so much. Let's give them a heart tap. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Great to see all of you. Hopefully I'll see you soon.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Let's free up the microphone, Susan.
Rebecca,
Rebecca, are you related to Phil and Jeanette Cushing?
Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Okay.
You're muted.
You're muted.
We're not muted.
I'm leaving.
Okay.
Bill Cushing was my grandmother Bessie's younger brother.
Ah, because they were founders of the temple in
in
Norwood.
yeah.
Right.
We lived for 30 years.
Yeah, right. So we were 40, yeah.
40
Yeah,
years.
the other members there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, they were very involved in,
Yes.
yes, in that, building
Very
that temple.
beneficial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
building that temple, yeah. So that, it is a small world.
It is, for sure.
Very
Good,
interesting.
yeah, it was very interesting.
Nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
What
Thanks,
amazing
Rebecca.
stories. Thank you.
Thank you very
It was
much.
wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. That was
Just
wonderful.
great.
Very
Thank you
special.
so much.
That was
Thank
great.
you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gideon.
Thank you, everyone.
And
Well
we saw
done.
you on Chronicle tonight.
Thank you so much.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.